Hey everybody, happy February. I can't believe we're already a month into the year. And so today I want to talk about everything that I read in the month of January. I read 7 books, which was pretty good. That was pretty solid. So I was like, wow, I have enough to make a whole video about. And yeah, I feel pretty good about my reading this month. I read some books that I really enjoyed, and I read a book from one new country on my list, which I will get to. But I read a good variety of different things and like publication dates and genres. So I think it was a good month, and I hope February is too. So let's get into the books that I read. I'll go in order of when I read them. So my first read of the year was The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin. I talked about this book in my video about books that I wanted to read this winter, and I started off strong by reading one of those books. And so I won't get too in-depth about it since I already talked about it, but it's a sci-fi book where one of the main characters, he comes to this new planet that he calls Winter, and he's basically trying to get the people on this planet to join the coalition of nations across planets that he's an ambassador for. And during that, he befriends one of the people who's high up in the society there, and he gets banished from their country because he supports this ambassador. But the ambassador doesn't really trust him, and he doesn't realize how much this other person is helping him behind the scenes. And this book covers so many different topics. It talks a lot about gender. The people who live on this planet are genderless for most of the month, and then for a few days they become either a man or a woman. And so it's interesting to see how a society would function without like that social aspect of it and hierarchy aspect. So it was a super interesting book. It also was a very wintry book, as you can imagine, and my favorite part was when the two of them, after they've kind of escaped, they do this big journey over this glacier, and it's really cool. It was really fun to read about, and yeah, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a great sci-fi book. I don't read a lot of sci-fi, but when I do read it, I usually like it, so I should read more. But it also was pretty short for a sci-fi book, so yeah, I enjoyed that one, and I'm glad I started off strong. The next book I read was also on my list for a book that I want to read this winter, and that is The True Deceiver by Tove Jansson. And this book was really atmospheric, and it was a really quiet book, but it packed a lot of punch. It was short, but it was really reflective, and yeah, I just really enjoyed it. It's basically about this young woman who is kind of a pariah in the town that she lives in, and she befriends this rich artist who lives in this big house. She's an older woman, basically under the guise to try to move into the house with her younger brother, who has some disabilities and isn't entirely accepted in the community. And so it's basically trying to figure out who is the true deceiver. Is it the girl Katri who's trying to move in, or is it the older woman who's kind of lying to herself about her life and her success and her family? And I thought it was extremely well written. I really enjoyed reading it. I read part of it in a wintry cabin in the woods, so that definitely brought the atmosphere in. But yeah, it was a really thoughtful book, and I recommend it. The next book that I read, I don't have with me because I haven't read it as an ebook, but it's Assata, an autobiography by Assata Shakur. And she was a member of the Black Panther Party and just like the Black Liberation Army, I believe is the name of the other group that she was a part of. Yes. And she was falsely accused of many crimes over the years, and it's about her, it's really a memoir of her life and her imprisonment, her childhood, how she became an activist as part of the civil rights movement, and eventually she escaped to Cuba, which she still lives there today, and I think she still like would be arrested if she came to the US, which is crazy. But it was a really eye-opening book to read, just the amount of horrible things she had to endure during her imprisonment, and just the lies that were spread about her. And it was basically what everyone in the US was led to believe, that she was this horrible criminal. But yeah, it was a really good insight into that time period and the civil rights movement at that time. And yeah, it was really interesting. She is a very straightforward writer, which I enjoyed. She kind of cut right to the chase, but also some of her poems were interspersed throughout, which were cool to read as well. So yeah, I enjoyed that too. I enjoyed every book I read this month, so I don't need to keep saying that, but yeah, the next one that I read is Stoner by John Williams, and that has been on my list for a while. I actually wanted to read it this fall, but it did not come in from the library in time. I also read this as an ebook. And it's about this, starts as a young man, and he lives on his family's farm. He's basically destined to take over the farm. He goes to college to study agriculture, but he ends up falling in love with English literature, and he goes with that, and he becomes a professor at the college that he went to. So he basically lives there his whole life, and it's just about his life and his relationships, his relationship with his wife, who he met and married very young, his relationships with the other faculty at the school, the students, and yeah, it brings you up to the end of his life. And it's just, it was a very it was a very simple like plot. Like, it was nothing crazy happened in the book, but you really got to know the characters in the book really well. Stoner, that's the name of the main character, that's where the title comes from. You just really get to see his inner world, and then you get to know the other characters really well. And so it was really just a book about an average person's life, which I thought was really nice to read. And yeah, it's a well-loved book for a reason. The next book that I read is There Is a Country, new fiction from the new nation of South Sudan. And this was edited by Nyuol, Lueth, Tong. And it is a very short story collection. And I was very excited when I found this book at a library book sale, because South Sudan is a new country, and I wasn't sure if I'd be able to find a book in English from there. So I'm very glad that I found this and picked it up. Like most short story collections, I liked some of the stories better than others. but I liked most of them. Some of the highlights for me were The Bastard, which is written by the editor, and that was about a young boy and his mother and how he sees her experience as, you know, as a woman in this country, and sees her relationships and the struggles that she goes through and things like that. So that one was good. Yeah, that was one of the standout ones for me. But overall, this covered a lot of different themes. Talked about war, which obviously there's currently a war going on in Sudan, not South Sudan, but, you know, the South Sudan came about as a product of a war, and also talks about love and, you know, many different themes. So I think that for such a short book, it covered a lot of ground. But my main complaint with the book is that all of the authors that are included are men, which I feel like I don't think the goal of this is to be a comprehensive review of literature from South Sudan, but to not even include one woman author seems a little bit of, you know, it's kind of a letdown, and just, you're really discluding this whole other major part of the literary community. So I feel like could have at least included one. So that was my main issue with this one, but I'm still glad that I read it, and I think it gave me a good insight and made me do a lot more background research on the country, and I learned a lot from that. So it was good. The next book that I read is The Message by Ta-Nehisi. I read one of his other books, Between the World and Me, which has become very popular. And that book is kind of written as a letter to his son as he's becoming a young Black man in America. And he is just such an amazing writer. The whole time, I did listen to this on audiobook, and he narrated the audiobook as well, which I highly recommend it because he has a great narrative voice. But he really connected all these different ideas so well together in one cohesive kind of study of many different topics. Basically, the format of the book is split into 3 parts. The first part is about the first time that he visits Africa. The second part is about him going to the South to speak with a school teacher who is using one of his books, Between the World and Me, in her class, and the school board is trying to get rid of it from the curriculum. So he goes down and visits her. And then the last part, which is the longest part of the book, is when he goes to Palestine for a literary conference. And the whole book talks about writing, obviously, and also identity and what it means to be an American, what it means to be Black in America, what that means in relating to other types of human rights struggles and issues. And yeah, it's so well written. I honestly want to buy a physical copy so I can highlight some quotes, because especially in the last part, he talks a lot about what it means to be a writer and the duty that writers have to tell the truth and paint an honest picture of things, and, you know, the moral duty to kind of stand up for what's right and see and talk about what you see is really happening. And he talks about that incredibly well. And yeah, I highly recommend this book. It covers a lot of ground, but it's very cohesive, and I think it's a really, really impressive book. So I recommend that one. And then the last book that I read this month is Bright Young Women by Jessica Knoll. This was also an ebook that I read, and this is more of a mystery thriller type of book. It follows this young woman who is the president of her sorority, and one night late, her sorority house gets attacked, and a murderer comes in and kills a few of the women in the house, and one of them is her best friend. So that's one timeline, and that's in the 70s. And then it follows another character a couple years earlier, who she becomes part of this grief support group, and at first you don't really know how she's connected to the other timeline, but one of the women that she meets in the grief group is also helping the sorority president girl solve this murder. So there's one kind of common character between the two. And I thought that this was really well done because I cared about both of the narratives. I wanted to know what was going to happen to both of the women. And I feel like a lot of times when you're reading a book with multiple perspectives, there's one that you're like, just get me back to that one. I don't really care about this other one. But I think that the author did that really well and executed that well. And the fact that I really cared about both of them. It wasn't as much of a mystery because you kind of know what happens, because it's based on a true story. And I won't say of which serial killer it's about, because kind of the whole point of the book is that it's focusing on the women's lives, the victims' lives, and their families and their friends, and how that affects them, versus focusing on the person who perpetrated this violence. And I thought that was really important to talk about too, because I think a lot of times in our media, it's very focused on, this crazy person or whatever, versus focusing on the people who were actually harmed in those situations. And I forget what I was saying before that, but that's okay. But yeah, I cared about both of them. I want to know what happened. Oh, it's not you kind of know what happens basically in the book. So it's not a mystery in that sense, but it's more of a mystery in how will we get to this end result? How are these women gonna move on with their lives and things like that? And so yeah, I really enjoyed it, especially the first half. I couldn't put it down. I think it was maybe a little bit too long, but overall it was really, it's a dark subject, but it was a quick read and light in a way in the in how easy it was to read. And yeah, that's it. That's everything I read in January. So thank you for watching. I will be back with another video soon, hopefully. And yeah, let me know if you read any of these books, what you thought of them. And I will see you next time. Bye.